The water shimmered like black glass beneath the moonlight, reflecting the opulent glow from the rooftop penthouse pool high above Manhattan. Laughter echoed from the corner where champagne flowed into crystal flutes and designer heels clicked along the marble. But Lana kept her eyes low, hands tightly gripping the hem of the borrowed cocktail dress that didn't quite fit, the fabric too tight around her chest, the straps threatening to slide from her narrow shoulders as she stood unnoticed at the edge of the celebration, pretending to belong to a world she never dared to dream of. She wasn't invited here, she knew that. She had come as a last-minute assistant to a catering friend who had begged her to help carry trays and clear glasses for one night. Just one night that might change everything if she found the courage to speak, to be heard, to ask for help for a place most billionaires had never even heard of, a crumbling shelter hidden behind forgotten streets, where the walls peeled like old wounds, and children slept to a cot, waiting for someone to believe they mattered. She clutched the folded letter in her purse, the one she had written over and over again for weeks, pleading for a chance, a donation, anything that could keep the shelter open through winter. The night air was crisp against her bare skin, and despite the heat lamps around the rooftop lounge, Lana shivered as if her soul knew she was out of place, out of time. She turned to leave, heart already retreating, when a loud splash drew gasps from the guests and turned every eye toward the pool where a game had begun. Bodies in swimsuits and silk dresses leapt and laughed, champagne pouring and glitter catching the sky. Then came the voice, smooth and low and laced with challenge, cutting through the noise like a blade of ice. Nicholas Thorne, CEO of Thorne Global, stood at the pool's edge, his white shirt rolled to the elbows, his watch glinting beneath the lights, his hair slightly tousled as if the wind dared touch him. He scanned the crowd, eyes sharp and unreadable, then pointed to her, not knowing her name, not caring that she wasn't part of the inner circle. "You, shy girl with the eyes, you haven't smiled once all night," he said with a half-smirk. "Come, show us you're not made of glass." Lana froze, confusion knotting her breath. She tried to shake her head, to melt into the shadows, but a pair of strong hands closed gently around her wrist, pulling her forward. "No," she whispered, too soft for anyone to hear. But Nicholas didn't stop. He stepped forward, and in one quick motion, he took her hand, tugged her toward the pool's edge, and with one final look into her wide eyes, he pulled her into the water with him. Time fractured as she plunged beneath the surface, the cold striking like truth, her breath caught in her throat as her dress ballooned around her legs, her heels slipping off, her world reduced to bubbles and panic, and the sharp realization that she was no longer invisible. She kicked upward, breaking through the surface, gasping as her wet hair clung to her face and met his gaze again, only this time she didn't look away. The crowd erupted in amused applause, thinking it all in jest, but Lana's chest rose and fell not from laughter, but from something deeper, something raw. The water clung to her skin, her fear burned beneath it, and Nicholas, standing beside her with droplets sliding down his jaw, suddenly saw not a game, but a girl who had been dragged underwater long before this night, yet never stopped fighting to surface again. That was when he stopped smiling. Lana Reeves was 24, barely out of college. Though she hadn't really attended in the usual way, her degree came piecemeal between night shifts, early morning train rides, and free internet courses downloaded from hospital lounges where she once mopped floors. She had grown up in the Ashfield Shelter for Girls, a red-bricked orphanage tucked behind a crumbling warehouse, a place where second-hand books served as lullabies, and the kindness of strangers determined whether a child ate me the week. Her earliest memory was of hunger. Her favorite was of warmth once, just once, when a mysterious donor paid for her emergency surgery at age 14. No name, no card, just a miracle wrapped in hospital bills that disappeared overnight. That moment became her compass, her reason, her quiet vow that she would someday give back the way someone had once given to her. But giving takes money, and Lana had none. What she had was resilience, the kind that made her smile at broken things and find meaning in scraps. She had worked as a barista, janitor, babysitter, server, and now helped part-time at the very shelter that raised her, mentoring little girls who still stared out broken windows, hoping someone would come for them. Then there was Nicholas Thorne, 32, heir to a tech media empire, the kind of man whose name appeared in bold headlines and sharp fonts, whose photos trended for his glare rather than his grin, whose silence was often louder than his commands. His reputation in the business world was clinical, precise, efficient, brutal when necessary. His staff feared him, investors respected him, competitors hated him, and none of that mattered to him because the only person he had ever tried to prove anything to was gone. His mother, Elena Thorne, had built the heart of their company's humanitarian wing, believing deeply in giving back, in building with purpose, until cancer took her 3 years ago. And since then, Nicholas buried her dreams beneath spreadsheets and shareholder meetings, believing emotions were distractions. The pool party was his annual charity gala, a twisted hybrid of networking and fundraising dressed up in luxury, the kind where guests sipped $1,000 cocktails while pitching multi-million-dollar causes. Lana had come by accident, or fate, helping her friend Paula, who worked for the event's catering team. She wasn't supposed to be near the pool. She wasn't supposed to be seen, but one moment of visibility had dragged her into the center of everything. She stood now in the bathroom stall of the rooftop lounge, cold and dripping, her soaked dress clinging to her skin like regret. She had left her purse behind, along with the letter and her only chance to reach him. She wanted to cry, to scream, to disappear. But instead she found herself staring into the mirror, watching water slide down her neck like truth, and somewhere deep inside, something clicked. Outside, Nicholas leaned against a railing, watching the skyline. The crowd had moved on, the moment forgotten like all entertainment at these parties, but he couldn't shake the look in her eyes. Not surprise, not anger, but something deeper, something honest. He'd meant it as a joke, a stupid, impulsive gesture to loosen the stiffness of the evening. Yet the feel of her wrist in his hand lingered longer than the applause. Back downstairs, Lana reappeared, no longer hiding, wrapped in a staff jacket, her hair damp but her spine straight. She approached the bar, whispered something to Paula, who frowned, then nodded and pointed toward a hallway where Nicholas had gone. It took all her strength to follow that direction, her feet trembling, but steady. She didn't know what she would say, only that she had to try, because the shelter had only weeks left before its doors shut forever. In the hallway, Nicholas looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his face for only a second before his features returned to stone. She stopped a few feet away, unsure how to begin. He tilted his head, arms crossed. "You came back," he said, voice cool. She swallowed hard. "I didn't come for the party," she said, then paused, choosing her words. "I came because I need your help." He raised a brow, expecting a pitch, a rehearsed plea, but she didn't hand him anything, just looked him dead in the eye. "I run a shelter," she said. "It saved me once, now it's falling apart, and I don't have donors or influence. I just have the truth, and I hoped you might still care about that." Nicholas studied her in silence, his face unreadable, then said, "Why me?" And she replied without blinking, "Because I think your mother would have." That was the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. Nicholas didn't respond right away, his breath shallow, as her words echoed in the narrow hallway. Your mother would have. He hadn't heard her name spoken like that in so long, not as a strategy, not as a PR tool or a boardroom memory, but as a living thing. Lana stood her ground though her fingers fidgeted slightly. He noticed it, the way she was both trembling and unyielding, and for the first time in months, something in him stirred. Curiosity, maybe, or the ache of something long buried. "Come," he said simply, and turned away. Lana followed him down a private corridor and into a quiet lounge away from the party. It was lined with books and dim lighting, the kind of room designed for quiet deals and whispered regrets. He motioned to the leather couch, and she sat, perching carefully on the edge, as if the furniture itself might judge her. Nicholas poured 2 glasses of water, no wine this time, then sat across from her and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Start from the beginning," he said. And so she did, not with statistics or desperate pleas, but with memories. She spoke of bunk beds stacked too close together, of a girl named Mia who hadn't made it through last winter, of the old woman who still ran the shelter on a pension and grit, of the time they celebrated birthdays with a single candle stuck into slices of bread because they couldn't afford cake. She spoke not for sympathy, but because it mattered, because if he was going to say no, she wanted him to know what he was walking away from. Through it all, Nicholas said little, but his fingers tightened around the glass, and his jaw clenched. In that way people do when they are trying not to feel. When she finished, silence settled like dust between them. She expected him to offer money, or to say nothing at all, but instead he asked, "Why haven't you given up?" And she smiled, small but honest. "Because someone didn't give up on me, even if I never knew who." That night he didn't write a check, didn't make promises, but he told her to meet him the next morning at his office. And she did, waiting nervously in the marble lobby of Thorn Global, while suits and heels clicked by without noticing her. But when his assistant called her name, people turned, curious about who had caught the attention of the infamous CEO. He had her sit in on his meeting with the foundation board, introduced her not as a guest, but as someone he wanted them to hear. Her voice shook at first, but grew steadier as she spoke, this time with statistics, with projections, with plans for how even a small investment could save real lives. The board listened, intrigued, but hesitant. It wasn't until Nicholas spoke that the tone shifted. "She's not asking for charity," he said, his voice sharp and calm. "She's asking for the kind of investment my mother would have made with her eyes closed." From that moment on, he involved her more than he needed to, had her review proposals, asked her opinion on philanthropic budgets, invited her to dinners she could barely afford to dress for, each time offering a simple, "wear something comfortable," and then watching with quiet amusement as she appeared in the same black dress with new courage behind her eyes. He was drawn to her, though he didn't say it, not in words, but in glances, held too long, in questions that lingered past business. Lana tried to keep her heart out of it, reminded herself that he was just helping because of his mother, because of guilt maybe. But it became harder to believe that when he brought her coffee himself, or remembered how she liked extra cinnamon, when he laughed softly at her dry humor, or waited outside meetings just to walk with her down to the subway entrance. One evening, he invited her to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new pediatric wing his company had sponsored. She stood beside him, the only woman not in designer heels, and he introduced her to donors as someone who reminded him of what mattered. Later, as they walked along the edge of the reflecting pool in the courtyard, she whispered, "I don't understand you." And he smirked. "Most people don't." But then he stopped walking, turned to face her, and added, "But I want you to." Lana didn't know how to answer, so she looked away, her hair catching the breeze. But he reached out gently, just a touch on her arm, not possessive, not demanding, just present. "You're not just a cause, Lana," he said, his voice lower now, more fragile than she'd ever heard. "You remind me of who I used to be, before all this made me forget." That night she didn't sleep, her heart and mind battling each other with every breath. She told herself not to fall for him, not to believe this was anything more than proximity and projection. But when he called the next morning just to ask how her shelter interview went, her chest tightened, and the truth slipped through the cracks of all her caution. A week later, he took her to his family's private estate upstate for a charity weekend. She wasn't sure why he insisted she come, but when she arrived, everything made sense. The sprawling gardens, the walls lined with his mother's books, and a single photo in the hallway. Elena Thorne holding a baby at a shelter not unlike Lana's, the same light in her eyes that Lana carried now. Nicholas found her staring at the photo, and when she looked at him, her voice broke slightly. "She would have understood." And he replied, "She would have loved you, not as a performance, but as a confession." The air between them turned fragile and electric. They stood there, two worlds trying to touch, and in that moment, she forgot to be afraid. Later that evening, as guests mingled near the lakeside dock, Lana wandered toward the water, heels in hand, her toes skimming the cool surface. Nicholas joined her without speaking, just stood beside her, silent and open. And then, without warning, he reached out, took her hand, and pulled her gently into the lake. Her laughter erupting in surprise, the cold water shocking and thrilling. They came up breathless, laughing, clothes-soaked, guests staring from afar, but neither of them cared, and as they floated beneath the stars, Lana looked at him and asked, "Why did you do that?" And Nicholas, brushing water from his lashes, answered quietly, because I wanted to feel something real again. That was the night everything shifted, not in declarations or grand gestures, but in the way they looked at each other afterward, like two people who had been underwater for too long and had finally come up for air. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning of something dangerous and beautiful, something neither of them could walk away from now. In the days that followed their unexpected swim beneath the stars, everything changed, not with fireworks or public admissions, but in the small things that stitched two separate lives into a fragile, blooming thread. Lana and Nicholas began spending more time together, not just within the confines of his office or the charity spaces, but in quiet moments outside the noise of their respective worlds, walks through museum halls after hours where he had pulled to unlock doors most could only dream of, dinners on rooftops not listed in public maps, long conversations over books neither of them had finished reading, and laughter more than either expected. But with each moment of closeness came the gravity of unspoken truths. Lana had never imagined herself falling for someone like him, not because of his money, not even because of the world he belonged to, but because love had always felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She had spent her entire life building barriers to protect her dreams, and now here was Nicholas, someone who could make them real with a signature, and it terrified her. He, on the other hand, found her disarming in a way no one else had ever been. She didn't play games, didn't angle for his approval, and that made her rare. She didn't care about the press or his last name, didn't flinch when he was silent for too long or direct to the point of discomfort. She simply existed beside him, real and unpretentious, and yet, as much as he wanted her in his world, part of him feared what bringing her into it fully would expose. It was during one of their late-night walks along the Foundation's new hospital project that cracks began to show. Lana had been quiet all evening, watching the workers pack up their tools as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Finally, as they sat on the hood of his car overlooking the site, she turned to him and asked, "Why this hospital, Nicholas? Why now?" And though he answered easily about expanding care, about legacy, she saw it in his eyes. Something else was there. She pressed gently. "You say it's for your mother, but is it really? Or is it for you?" Nicholas didn't answer right away, his jaw tense. "Does it matter?" he finally asked, and Lana nodded slowly. "Yes, it does, because I want to believe this isn't just about fixing the past. I want to believe it's about building something real." Later that night, Nicholas stood in his penthouse, looking out across the skyline, glass of whiskey in hand, his reflection staring back at him through the window, her words replayed in his mind. And for the first time in years, he felt unsure. His entire life had been built on certainty plans, precision, control, but Lana made him feel things that didn't follow logic. He thought back to the beginning, to how it all started, and a memory surfaced, one he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. The day his mother whispered on her hospital bed that she wanted her final act of legacy to be about love, not money. She had handed him a sealed letter addressed to "the one who reminds you how to feel," and he had buried it in a drawer, unopened, unwilling to let it dictate his future. The next morning, something pulled him toward that drawer. He opened it, fingers trembling slightly, and read the letter. Inside were words he hadn't expected. His mother had known him better than he ever gave her credit for. She had seen the coldness taking over and begged him not to let it win, to find someone who made him remember who he was before the world required him to wear armor. And suddenly, every look Lana had given him, every question she asked, every moment she stood beside him made sense. But the truth wasn't just about feelings, it was about the reason she was there to begin with. Lana had come to him not because of attraction, not even because of fate, but because she needed to save something. Her shelter, her girls, her past, and as much as he wanted to believe what they had, was untouched by transaction. A sliver of doubt began to grow in him, the question he couldn't silence. If he hadn't been able to help her, would she still have stayed? And Lana had her own shadows, secrets she hadn't yet voiced, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because part of her still didn't believe she belonged. At night, she lay in her small apartment, staring at the chipping paint and worn-out furniture, wondering if the connection she felt with Nicholas was real or just an illusion shaped by circumstance. One afternoon, while organizing files for a foundation event, she stumbled upon a folder she wasn't meant to see, a spreadsheet tracking donation. Cycles and her name was on it, listed not under the shelter's budget line but as a special project under executive discretion, next to an alarmingly high figure. Her chest tightened, the air in the room thinning. She had thought she was earning his respect, his interest, his heart. But what if she was just another line item? She didn't confront him right away. Instead, she carried the weight in silence, testing every word he spoke against the fear that maybe it was all staged, that maybe this connection wasn't mutual, maybe he was helping her out of guilt, or worse, pity. Meanwhile, Nicholas sensed the shift in her, the way her smiles felt guarded, how she pulled away when he touched her shoulder, how their late-night talks grew shorter. He tried to ignore it, believing it would pass, but when he invited her to the annual Thorn Gala and she hesitated, something in him cracked. That night at the gala, Lana wore a pale gold dress borrowed from a friend, and Nicholas couldn't look away. Yet something was off. Her laugh was quieter, her presence there but distant, as if she were protecting herself from something only she could see. He pulled her aside onto the balcony, city lights glimmering below, and asked, "What's wrong?" And when she looked at him, her eyes were too clear. "You paid for me," she said, not accusing, not angry, just broken. Nicholas froze. "I didn't." He stopped, realizing he didn't know how to explain without sounding exactly like what she feared. "I saw the budget line," she continued, voice steady but soft. "Executive? Discretion? That's not love, Nicholas. That's control." He stepped forward, hands raised slightly. "Lana, I didn't do that to buy you. I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of your shelter closing. I did it because I believe in you." But she shook her head. "You should have told me, given me the choice, because now I don't know if any of this is real." He reached out, but she took a step back, the wind catching her hair, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I thought you saw me," she whispered, "not as a project, not as a charity case, just me." And with that, she turned and left, her footsteps fading into the hum of the gala, leaving Nicholas standing there, surrounded by everything he had built, yet suddenly feeling like he had lost the only thing that mattered. Back in her apartment that night, Lana stared at the unopened envelope he had once given her, the one labeled, "For the Future." Inside, she knew, was the deed to a new building, one meant for her clinic, her dream, but now it felt like a chain. She wanted to believe in him, in them, but belief alone couldn't erase what had been done in silence, what had been offered without consent, what had blurred the line between giving and owning. At his penthouse, Nicholas poured another drink he didn't touch, his mother's letter sitting open on his desk, her words now clearer than ever. Real love can't be built on imbalance, only choice, only truth. He finally understood, but he didn't know if he had already lost the chance to prove it. The rain returned on a Thursday evening, soft at first, then heavier as the sky darkened over the city. In her small apartment, Lana sat by the window, curled beneath a threadbare blanket, staring at the lights across the skyline that shimmered through the fogged-up glass. Each drop against the window echoed her thoughts, relentless and unsure. She hadn't spoken to Nicholas in 4 days, and though she told herself it was better this way, her heart hadn't stopped aching since the gala. She had walked away, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much, too deeply, and didn't know how to breathe in a world where love and power blurred so easily. At the same moment in the tower overlooking the city, Nicholas stood by his office window, silent. His phone lying untouched on the desk behind him, messages from Sarah, his assistant, blinking unread, meetings postponed, calls ignored because none of it mattered. The company ran without him. But his world had stopped the moment Lana left the balcony, with her eyes full of quiet devastation, and he had let her go. He told himself he had done the right thing by helping her anonymously, that he had kept his feelings out of it. But the truth was, he'd acted out of fear. Fear that if she knew how deeply he felt, she would think it came with strings. He hadn't trusted her enough to choose freely, and now he feared she never would. Downstairs in the garage, the rain began to bounce louder against the concrete walls, and Nicholas grabbed his coat, his decision made not by logic but by something he hadn't trusted in a long-time instinct. He drove without thinking, the city flying past in streaks of wet light, until he reached Ashfield Shelter, the old red-bricked building, where everything had started for her. He parked outside, unsure if she would be there, but needing to try. Inside, Lana was finishing a story, with one of the younger girls curled beside her on the worn couch, the child's hand small and warm in hers, as she closed the book and whispered goodnight. She turned to find Nicholas standing in the doorway, soaked from the rain, his eyes locked on her. The room fell quiet as their gazes met, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, she stood slowly, her steps hesitant but steady as she moved toward him, heart pounding with confusion and something deeper. "I shouldn't have come like this," he said, his voice rough from days of silence. "But I had to see you." Lana didn't speak, just looked at him, unsure what she wanted to hear. He stepped forward, his hands open and empty. "You were right," he said softly. "I should have told you from the beginning. I should have let you decide, not just about the money or the shelter or the building, but about me, all of me." Her breath hitched and she took a step back, unsure whether to run or to stay. "I wasn't trying to control you," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I was trying to give back, the way my mother did, the way someone once gave to me when I was broken, but I let fear get in the way. I didn't believe you could love someone like me without needing something in return, and that's not fair to you or to us." Lana looked down at her hands, trembling at her sides. She wanted to believe him, but the wound was still fresh. "The clinic," he said next. "It's still yours if you want it, but not because I'm giving it, because I'm stepping back and letting you build it, fully, freely, with your name on the door and no strings attached. You deserve that." She lifted her gaze slowly, tears stinging her eyes. "Why now?" she asked barely above a whisper. "Because I finally read her letter," he answered, his voice cracking. "My mom's last wish. She said I'd find someone who reminded me how to feel again, someone who made me believe in something real. I didn't know it then, but she meant you." Lana's knees weakened, and she reached for the edge of the couch to steady herself, the words hitting her like a storm she hadn't prepared for. "You're the first person who's seen me," he added. "Not the CEO, not the last name. Just me. And I didn't know how much I needed that until you were gone." She stood frozen, unsure if this was truth or just another beautifully constructed speech. But then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Gently he placed it in her hand. It was the pendant she had lost at the pool weeks ago, engraved with her initials on the back. Something she hadn't even told him existed. "I found it the day after," he said. "Kept it because I couldn't let go of that night. It reminded me of you, of how everything changed." Her fingers closed around the metal worm from his hand. Then in the doorway behind them, one of the girls coughed, breaking the silence, and Lana glanced back, suddenly reminded of why she had come back here, why this mattered more than anything. "You helped me," she said finally, her voice steady. "But more than that, you saw something in me I didn't even know was there. I just needed to know it was real." Nicholas nodded slowly. "It's real," he said, "more than anything else in my life, and I'm not asking you to forgive me or love me back or start over. I'm just asking you to believe me. One more time." The storm outside softened to a drizzle as Lana took a step forward, her hand still holding the pendant. "I don't want a perfect man," she said quietly. "I want someone who chooses truth, even when it hurts." He looked at her eyes, full of something he hadn't dared to name, and for the first time in years she smiled, not from obligation or politeness, but because she felt it in her bones. "I don't care about the penthouse or the money or the suits," she continued. "I care about the man who stood in this shelter, drenched in rain, asking for another chance without pride or promises, just honesty." He exhaled sharply as though he'd been holding his breath for years. "Then let's build something honest," he said, "brick by brick, not because we owe it to the past, but because we believe in the future." And there, in the center of that broken but sacred place where she had first learned to hope, Lana reached out and took his hand, the warmth of it grounding her in the moment. Outside, the streetlight flickered against the wet pavement, and inside, two hearts once divided by class and silence began to beat in unison, no longer afraid to be seen, no longer afraid to fall. The next morning, sunlight slipped gently through the narrow blinds of the small shelter room, casting quiet stripes of gold across Lana's sleeping face, her breath slow and even, wrapped in the softness of early peace beside her. On the chair where he had dozed off sat Nicholas, his tie loosened, his jacket folded neatly on the armrest, a man out of place in every way, yet somehow fitting perfectly in the stillness of this world he had once avoided. Her eyes fluttered open, catching the rise and fall of his chest, and in that moment, a quiet warmth spread through her. Not from proximity, but from the growing realization that he had stayed, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that meant everything. Their morning was a blur of small tasks and quiet glances. Lana guiding the girls through breakfast, Nicholas helping fix a leaky faucet, with surprising patience and clumsy effort. They didn't talk about last night, didn't try to define what was shifting between them, but it pulsed beneath every shared look like a thread pulling tighter with each passing moment. Later that afternoon, as Lana reviewed paperwork in the shelter office, Sarah arrived, her expression tense, folder in hand. She hesitated at the door, then stepped in, eyes flicking from Nicholas to Lana. "There's something you need to see," she said, and handed Lana the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and a single typed letter. It was from the board of Thorn Enterprises, confirming that a private investor had submitted a proposal to purchase the clinic project, with intent to convert the land into a luxury hotel. Lana's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her heart sinking. Nicholas stood frozen, reading over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with every word. "This isn't from our company," he muttered, scanning the letterhead. "This is a hostile offer, and someone on the inside had to leak the project timeline, or the buyer wouldn't have known when to strike." Lana looked at him wide-eyed. "But we already broke ground, the permits are secured," she whispered. Nicholas shook his head. "It doesn't matter if they can outbid the board. They can freeze progress and bury us in litigation long enough to drain the funding. We don't have time to play their game." Sarah's voice was low, urgent. "There's more. It's Mark again. He's been using a shell company to work around the board restrictions. His end game isn't the land. It's destroying everything you two built." Lana pressed a hand to her chest, the betrayal sharper now that it threatened more than her dreams. It threatened the girls she swore to protect, and the hope that had barely begun to bloom. Nicholas turned to Sarah, his eyes cold. "We end this. Now call the board, set a meeting for tonight. I'll handle the rest." Later that evening, the boardroom at Thorn Enterprises gleamed with polished glass and chrome. A far cry from the warmth of the shelter, every seat was filled, the air tense with expectation. At the head, Nicholas stood tall, composed beside him, Lana in a plain navy dress that carried more confidence than any designer gown ever could. As Nicholas laid out the truth, the room shifted from indifference to discomfort, then finally to silent respect. Sarah handed out the evidence of Mark's interference, traced transactions, fake companies, and blackmail attempts one by one, every lie unraveled until nothing was left but the truth. Then came the twist, the moment no one expected. As Nicholas finished speaking, he stepped back, allowing Lana to approach the table. The entire board watched as she placed a single folder in front of them. Inside were handwritten letters from every girl at the shelter, every volunteer, every nurse who believed in the clinic and what it stood for. She didn't give a speech, didn't beg, just looked each member in the eye and said quietly, "This place isn't just bricks and permits. It's where forgotten children learn. They're not invisible, and if you take it from them, you're not just killing a building, you're killing belief." The room fell into a heavy silence until one board member, an older woman with silver hair, nodded slowly and said, "Let the girl build her clinic." And just like that, the tide turned, the vote passed, the sale blocked, and Mark's power shattered in one unanimous decision. After the meeting, as the boardroom emptied, Lana leaned against the wall, her knees weak with relief. Nicholas stood beside her, watching the last door close, and without thinking, he reached for her hand. They didn't speak, just breathed in the stillness of victory, until Lana looked up and whispered, "You fought for me." And Nicholas answered without hesitation, "No, I fought for us." But before they could hold that moment fully, Sarah burst through the door, Her phone pressed to her ear, her expression white with shock. "It's the shelter," she said breathlessly. "There was a fire, someone broke in, the back wall's been destroyed. They think it was deliberate." Lana's heart stopped, and without a word she bolted down the hall. Nicholas right behind her within minutes. They were in his car, the city blurring past again, but this time with dread in their throats when they arrived. Flashing lights painted the red brick in shades of disaster. The fire had been small but targeted. Someone had thrown accelerant through the broken window of the back room, and the damage, though contained, had ripped through the place like a scar. The girls were safe, evacuated, early by a staff member, but the space was ruined. Water damage, smoke blackening the walls. Lana walked through the ruins, her shoes crunching on glass, her heart breaking anew. Nicholas stayed close, watching the pain on her face grow deeper with each step. "This wasn't just about scaring us," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "It was about erasing the place that made me who I am." He didn't answer, just placed a steadying hand on her back and said, "Then we rebuild bigger, stronger, and louder, so no one can silence it again." That night she stood in what remained of the girls' dormitory, staring at a scorched drawing on the wall. Someone had written the word hope in crayon once bright. Now smeared and darkened by smoke, she pressed her fingers to it and felt the memory of her younger self, the girl who had nothing but belief, and she made a decision not from anger or revenge, but from purpose. She turned to Nicholas, her eyes burning not with tears, but with fire. "We start tomorrow," she said, "from the ground up, and this time it won't just be a clinic or a shelter, it'll be a promise." And he smiled because he saw it now, clearly, that this wasn't the end. This was the moment before the rise, the place where ashes give way to wings. 1 year later, the sun rose over the city, with a warmth that had been missing for too long, its golden light spilling across the new courtyard of the Carter Community Center, where children's laughter echoed between newly built walls, and nurses in soft blue scrubs moved with quiet purpose through bright, clean halls. Lana stood by the front entrance, a clipboard in hand, and a smile tugging at her lips, as the first patients of the day arrived through glass doors etched with her mother's name beneath a simple phrase, "No one is turned away here." She wasn't the same girl who once hid behind library stacks, afraid of her own voice. She was stronger, rooted in something deeper than fear or doubt. Behind her, Nicholas approached his steps, slower now, more thoughtful, his suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder and a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He hadn't brought roses this time because he remembered she once said she liked flowers that grew without permission, without pruning, just wild and full of color. He handed them to her without words, and she took them, eyes bright, with something unspoken. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and said gently, "You built this." And she looked around the center, children in the reading corner, patients in recovery rooms, sunlight flooding the atrium, and whispered back, "We did." Outside, a small crowd began to gather, journalists, community leaders, city officials, but none of that mattered more than the presence of the shelter girls, now older, standing at the front row, beaming with pride. Sarah stepped forward, clipboard in hand, announcing the ribbon cutting, and Lana took the scissors, Nicholas by her side, and with one clean motion, they opened the doors, not just to a building, but to a legacy of healing and hope. The crowd clapped, but Lana heard only the quiet rush of something deeper. A promise kept a circle closed. As the guests explored the center, Nicholas led her to the rooftop garden, a quiet space above the noise below, where flowers bloomed against the skyline and the hum of the city felt distant. He turned to her, his voice low. "There's one thing I haven't done yet." She looked up, curious, and he pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box, opening it slowly to reveal not a diamond, but a simple silver ring engraved on the inside with 2 words, "Just us." Her breath caught, and he continued, "This started as a fight for something bigger than ourselves. But somewhere along the way, I found the one thing I didn't know I was missing. You've always been the brave one, Lana. Now I just want to be the one who stands beside you through whatever comes next." She didn't need time to think, didn't need speeches or grand gestures, just reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, and nodded with a smile that said everything that words couldn't. And as he slid the ring onto her finger, the wind picked up, carrying petals from the garden into the sky, like confetti from the earth itself, and down below the center buzzed with life, with second chances, with quiet miracles, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt soft again, because sometimes love isn't about fireworks or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about who shows up when the fire has already passed, who stays when the silence feels heavy, who believes when everything else says, give up. And that day, as they stood hand in hand beneath the wide open sky, the girl who once whispered her dreams into the dark and the man who had once built walls to protect his heart finally understood one thing. Love isn't just about who you are. It's about who you become together, and when it's real, it doesn't care about status or scars. It just grows wild and true and free.